Hello and welcome to Trinity Talk Live. I'm Ken Coughlin. I'm totally paying attention, and that is
Ben Lander.
He's paying more attention than I am. I'm looking at the screen, not at the camera. Can we just start over? All right, wait, here we go. Hi, I'm Ken Coughlin.
And I'm Ben Lander. Now I'm not paying attention.
Welcome to Trinity Talk Live, water cooler conversation from a Christian. I normally say that first. I say Trinity Talk Live, water cooler conversation from a Christian perspective. I'm Ken Coughlin.
And I'm Ben Lander.
And now we're on track. So, okay, welcome to the show, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully, if this is your first time watching, hopefully you haven't turned us off already. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Let me tell you a little bit about the show if you're unfamiliar with it. The byline there says it all, water cooler conversation from a Christian perspective. Our goal on this show is to talk about some of the same topics that everybody out there in the world is talking about around the water cooler, so to speak. But what brings a level of uniqueness to our show is we try to do it specifically from a Christian perspective. While we know there's no shortage of places you can go out there on the internet that will tell you everything they think about every story that's out there, including the comments section, which is a very unhealthy practice, by the way, to look through the comments section. What we try to do here is we try to put Christ first. So doesn't mean we're always going to get it right. Doesn't mean we're always going to agree. You may disagree with us too. But at least the motivation is to try to talk about these issues from a Christian perspective with Jesus taking priority. So let's see if we succeed tonight or not. Hey, speaking of nothing particularly, you can join in the conversation here. And the way you do that is by commenting. Either if you're watching us on YouTube, on the Trinity Joppa YouTube channel, you can comment in the live chat. If you're watching us on Facebook, you can comment in the comments section. I have both of those up here and running on my computer, and I actually do have them up and running this week, Ben. I saw you looking over to see if I actually did. And I should theoretically see your comment here on the screen as it pops up. And once we see that, once there's a lull in the lull, that sounds wrong, a convenient point in the conversation, I will read that on the air and we'll insert it and we will answer any questions, respond to any comments, so your opinion matters, throw it out there. If for any reason I don't see it because Wi-Fi goes out or whatever, our lovely producer, my wife back there, has little signs that she will hold up with a Facebook logo and the YouTube logo to alert me to look at my computer, or if that's not working, to pull out my phone, and we will find your comment that way. So please join in the conversation today. We got some really interesting topics, I think, to talk about. Let's get started, shall we? Our first topic, again, we don't usually... I don't want to say usually, we don't get political on this show. We don't go there. Yeah. We don't endorse particular candidates. But at the same time, it doesn't mean we don't talk about politicians either. I mean, when they say things, do things that directly bear on our roles as Christians, and we talk about it. And I like to think we've been reasonably fair in both sides. And for those of you, I'm prefacing this because, yes, we're about to talk about Joe Biden. And for those that think that, it's just another, right-wing conservative people going off on the Democrat, look at episode 2 weeks ago when we talked about President Trump. I mean, we've done it both.
Or the episode where we both said we're independent.
Yeah, so exactly. There's that too. I mean, this is a story that came out about the recent town hall meetings. And for those of you that, haven't been paying attention, there were supposed to be, like there always are, 3 presidential debates, 1 vice presidential debate. We had the first presidential debate, and then between the first presidential debate and the second debate, President Trump was diagnosed with COVID, and that kind of forced some scheduling issues. And so what the debate commission ended up doing was, rather than even having a debate for debate number 2, they had what's been called dueling town hall meetings, where President Trump had one town hall meeting where he was asked questions, and former Vice President Joe Biden had another town hall meeting where he was asked questions, but they weren't together. They weren't in the same room together. Well, this particular story comes out of Joe Biden's town hall meeting. During his town hall meeting, he was asked a question by, and I believe the pronunciation is Mika Hake or Hack. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. Miss Hake is the mother of an 8-year-old child, and her child identifies as transgender. And she asked Mr. Biden, former Vice President Biden, whether he would overturn President Trump's, and this is a quote from her question, dangerous and discriminatory agenda in regard to transgender rights. And this was a quote from Vice President Biden's response. He said, "I will flat out just change the law, eliminate those executive orders. There is no reason to suggest that there should be any right denied your daughter that your other daughter has the right to be and do." Now, this comment did spark some backlash from Christian groups, specifically the Family Research Council Action, released an analysis in response to Vice President Biden's comments, claiming that scientific research has shown long-term harm in gender transition among minors. So again, the specific issue here, this isn't even a broader transgender conversation here. The conversation that's been spurred on is specifically dealing with young children, in this case an 8-year-old child who is claiming to be transgender, and Vice President Biden's comments basically saying there shouldn't be any rights denied to someone at that age who's identifying as transgender. And so that raises the question of, well, and I know politicians sometimes say things to, very vaguely, but if you take that at its literal meaning, there shouldn't be any rights denied to an 8-year-old who identifies transgender. Does that mean that we should be starting he's saying we should be starting hormone therapy and surgeries and everything like that at that age? And that's certainly the question, I should say, or the issue that a lot of people have objected to. And you get to start the conversation on this one, Ben.
Well, yeah, since you went there, there's actually a couple different things I could pick out from this. But the conversation, I think, really does fall to the rights issue, because even looking at the comments on this was an article from Newsweek, and a lot of comments were coming in that, look, it's not a big deal. An 8-year-old at that point can't begin hormone treatments or anything. But if you listen and pay attention to what is implied in this by saying, I'll just flat out change the law. Well, first of all, the president doesn't have the ability to just flat out change the law necessarily.
No, but he does have the right to remove any executive orders that President Trump has to. Yes,
absolutely.
You're right, but not like legislation. He
right. So that's kind of misleading, is that just flat out changing the law, because he's made other comments about it making it the law of the land. I don't know if that's speaking directly. I forget exactly what that was in context of, but still, kind of, he doesn't have that ability to flat out, so to speak, change the law. However, these people who are saying in the comments even that it's that an 8-year-old doesn't have the ability to begin hormone treatment. Well, the implication here is that if Biden is successful in this, then they would. And that, I think, is the issue. And that's why so many people are concerned with that, is the question of, should they be allowed to? Should they have those rights? Because as a minor, they're still under the custody of their legal guardian. And so should they be able to do that? And it kind of falls in line with, at least I think, would kind of fall in line with something along the lines of a minor getting an abortion or something without parental consent. It's that same, should minors be allowed to make these decisions with permanent repercussions without their parental consent? Being the parent of an 8-year-old, I would say no. Yeah. And that's not even bringing into the Christian perspective yet. That's from a parental perspective. I wouldn't give my 8-year-old the ability. He's a smart kid, but I wouldn't trust him to make any permanent life-changing decisions at this point in his life.
Is he really 8?
He is. That's crazy. Yeah.
That means you're getting old, man.
I know. It's crazy. Don't remind me. But so from a purely, I guess, rights issue, I disagree with that for sure. But from a Christian perspective then, because it also talks about, even brings up in here his faith, that Biden is Catholic, and not many people, it's like, I think 56% of Americans were unaware of his Catholic faith, 44% were. And at least from a Christian perspective, from his faith perspective, I kind of have trouble seeing how this position is congruent with his affirmation of the Catholic faith too.
Yeah, I think several of his positions are not congruent with what the Catholic Church teaches. We'll talk a little bit about the Catholic Church and a kind of different thing. I don't know if it's going to tie in or not later on as we get through our topics today. But obviously, his position on abortion has been cited. And I know there was at least one a Catholic clergy member that advocated denying him communion because of his stances that's been taken on abortion. I don't think the Catholic Church has officially said they're doing that or anything, but I know it's been raised. And so, yeah, I guess what I'm trying to focus on the issue here, because I know if we really start getting into the whole transgenderism as a whole, that's going to open a can of worms and could take up the entire show. And I think honestly, and here's why I'm glad we're addressing the story, because I think regardless of how you feel about the broader issue of transgenderism, hopefully I would hope people can see that this is something different. This is something even more than that. But it gets back to, we like to have like worldview conversations on the show lots of times. And I think one of the dangers of worldviews is this almost the snowball going downhill and getting more and more snow as it goes kind of thing. And it's like if your worldview says that X is permissible, then you start to get into and let's face it, the position of those who believe or are in favor of transgender rights. I hate to even say that because that's a whole other conversation.
It's unequivocal, right? Children's
but that's my point. Is like, okay, so if you're saying this is determined at birth, which by the way, most research does not show that. It shows that while it's possible there are some nature elements, there are also some other environmental elements to a lot of this stuff. But we're not even getting into that. But if your position is, well, this is predetermined at birth, well then why not an 8-year-old? I mean, it's already been determined. So why can't we start hormone therapy for an 8-year-old? And so I think it's kind of one of these things where worldviews have consequences. But your point is very well taken. And I just anybody who thinks about somebody at that age, or think of yourself at that age. Are you the same person today that you were when you were an 8-year-old?
Not at all.
Not at all. Neither am I. And there's plenty of research that shows even children in this specific scenario. And there's a term for it, gender dysphoria. People may not like that term, but it exists. It is what it is. There plenty of research that shows the vast majority of children who are having these types of feelings at that age I don't want to use the term grow out of them, because maybe that sounds, like just leave them alone. I don't know. I mean, but they do eventually not feel that way anymore. And so if you're being objective and looking at that research, in my mind on it, it's like, well, wait a minute. If you're going to say that every child who's 8 years old and is identifying this way has the right to proceed with irrevocable changes, if you as a parent and you want to start treating your child a certain way, we may have some disagreements about that, but at least that's not biologically irreversible.
Right.
But the frightening thing about the Vice President's comments here, and again, maybe he was just speaking generally. I admittedly, I didn't see this live, so I don't know if there was some context that was being missing here, and I'd be certainly willing to hear him clarify. I just don't know if he will. But when you make such a broad-based comment, there should be no rights denied.
Well, that's that word unequivocal.
Unequivocal. I just kind of want to say, hold on. Do you really mean that? I mean, have you really thought through what that would include? Yeah. And yes, we live in a free country, so we can have discussions about whether or not this should this should be allowed, that should be allowed. This is a good thing, that should be allowed, or that should be a good thing. And there's plenty of examples where we can disagree about something, but also agree that what, I may not think you should do that, but we're living in a free country, so you should be able to do that. But at the same time, we also have a moral duty to, especially when it comes to children, to be the caretakers and take a step back and make a more rational decision for their own protection. And I saw, Jeanette, I did see your comment here. We'll get, since that's kind of on a different topic, we'll get to that one in a second.
And just developmentally speaking, as that child grows, I mean, look, there's a reason that a child is not allowed to purchase cigarettes or alcohol until they reach a certain age. They haven't developed enough to make those decisions for themselves, which Surgeon General's warning is right on the label that can be harmful. And I'm not, maybe to a degree it's kind of comparing apples and oranges here, but my point being that an 8-year-old, if we're protecting them from smoking or drinking at that age, but we're going to say it's fine to start hormone therapy,
right?
I see
and that's what gets this point. Even if, let's play, I don't want to say it that way. Let's put on the role of someone who is completely in favor of transgender rights. Because again, this may be illustrating my point that this is kind of a different issue. All right, let's put on that hat for a minute. All right, if you don't think an 8-year-old is capable of making those decisions and recognizing things like you're saying right there, do you really think an 8-year-old, even assuming transgenderism is exactly what you think it is, right? Is an 8-year-old capable of making that decision?
Developmentally speaking, I would say no.
I would say no. And so that's why I say this is a different issue that I just like to encourage people to kind of take a step back and let's just think about this for a minute. We don't put these even if you think ultimately when they're older that kind of decision is something they should be able to make. You gotta recognize that at that age, at 8 years old, there's plenty of decisions of far less permanent consequence that we're not letting our children make because we recognize they're not capable of doing that.
Right. I think that's what it boils down to.
Yeah. So what Jeanette says here, ready, and I'll let you take a spin on this one. When we were talking about the fact that we've tried to be balanced, and we are both independent. She says, yes, you have been fair. Thank you, Jeanette. I'm glad you feel that way. So let's talk about Biden. Where's Hunter?
Oh no. Yeah, that's a different topic altogether. I've kind of been reading here and there about. I'm assuming, Jeanette, you're talking about the emails and everything. That story that's been leaked by the Washington Post. It's actually it was Washington Post, right? New York Post.
I don't remember. New York Post would be a more conservative outlet than the Washington Post, so I would tend to think that's more likely, but it could be the Washington Post.
One of those news outlets. But anyway, that's kind of a quagmire. I think ultimately it is interesting that Twitter, and this goes into the whole censorship thing because that's really at the forefront of this issue. It's interesting that they took it down because of their policy that it was hacked materials policy, that they don't use hacked materials. But I'm sorry. Yeah.
The general issue. You may remember this story, folks, from some time ago. That was kind of brushed aside, where Hunter Biden is. I'm going to try to remember as much of it as I can. It's been a while. I haven't looked too deeply into it since the new emails come out. Other than I've read the story, but Hunter Biden was on the board of directors of it was Ukraine, wasn't it?
It was a Ukrainian company.
And either the board or the officers or something of that company were under investigation by the top legal authority, basically like the Attorney General or whatever of the Ukraine. And President Biden, Vice President, I'm sorry, thank you. Vice President Biden, at the time he was in office, was advocating, he actually went to the Ukraine and advocating the removal of this official from office. Now, according to him, it's completely unrelated to anything that was going on with this investigation with the company, and that he wasn't alone. There were, and that he's right, is my understanding. There were quite a few people from multiple nations wanting this person removed from office. There's a video that's circulating. You can look it up. I don't remember what event it was at, where he was basically, maybe bragging's not the right word, but boasting about the fact that he was able to get this person removed from office. That he basically went there and said, if you don't either you remove this person from office, or I think it was some kind of aid that was going to be denied, and he got this person removed from office. And so the suggestion was that he did this to favor his son, who was serving on being paid large salary. I don't want to say exactly what it was. I don't remember what it was.
I think between 50 and 75 million.
A
month.
To serve on this board where he really wasn't doing a whole lot, and kind of an advisory role at best, is my understanding. Back when this story first broke many months ago, the question was the Vice President Biden's response, like I said, was totally unrelated. I was doing this because all the international community was pressing for this, and we were just part of it. What just came, and he even said, I never had any conversations with my son about his business dealings. What's come out, and again, I'm going to try to be as accurate as I can. This is obviously a comment that just came up now, so if I get some of the facts wrong, I apologize. I'm trying to remember it as best I can. Correct me if you remember something differently. Emails have come out, I believe, between officials or somebody connected with the company and Hunter Biden, where essentially those emails have indicated that he did talk to his father, referred to him as the big man or something like that. about, I don't know if it was specifically about the investigation. I can't remember the topic of the email that went into all of that. But it's being used to say that Vice President Biden wasn't being honest when he said he hadn't talked to Hunter about this.
At least one of those emails seemed to heavily insinuate an exchange of favor in turn for monetary remuneration. And so there was kind of this whole, that's what it centers around, is that illegal exchange of political favor for monetary gain. And these emails, the way they were obtained, he dropped off his laptop at this shop to get repaired. He never picked it back up, and so that became property of that shop, who then they released the contents of that computer, and somehow or another, this is kind of vague, I guess Rudy Giuliani got a hold of it and leaked it, or as I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's at least my understanding.
Right.
And now it was passed by a couple of journalists, but then I think it was the Washington Post that then released it. And, kind of, and this story has been, and this I guess is where I was going initially, was the story has been actively censored. I mean, we'll call it what it is. On Twitter, they blocked accounts that were sharing it, and they blocked the post itself, citing their hacked information misnomer, so that it was obtained by hacked information. But thinking about that logically, if it's
not hacked information,
it's not. That's a misnomer, because if it was hacked information, it would be true information, just illegally obtained.
Right, and there was nothing illegally obtained about this. That's and lawyer hat on for a minute. If you have, it's called a mechanics lien or something like that, and a lot of places have policies like this. If you leave something for repair and you don't come to pick it up, eventually it's gonna become the property. Because think of it like in terms of a car. All right, you have a car that's damaged, all right, and you leave it someplace in some mechanic. Well, that mechanic, if you don't come to pick up your car, you're taking up space in their shop that they could be using for other things. That's not fair to them. And so there are lots of times there are provisions where, you know what, if you don't get it after a while, it's theirs, and then they could sell it to a. Why are you looking at me like that? You're looking at me funny. Sorry, did I forget and leave something at a repair shop? But it can become their property, and they can sell it to a junkyard or something like that. So it wasn't illegally obtained.
Well, I guess the argument could be made is that the laptop itself, the hard drive, was property of that shop owner, but the software, the contents that are housed on a separate server, i.e. those emails, were not their property.
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I guess the question is whether the email's downloaded in some way to the hard drive. I don't know the answer to that, but that's an interesting take on it. But yeah, I mean, maybe we'll not get taken off of YouTube for this, because it's not listed as one of our stories, so maybe we don't know we're talking about it. No, but it's interesting. Now I'm gonna put on my fair hat now. All right, and this is just, I look at things like, if I were let's say that I were a defense attorney hired by Vice President Biden to defend him in this. Email doesn't involve him. In other words, it refers to him. It doesn't. It's not from him. It's not to him. There's no indication. I mean, look, I've had instances, and I'm sure everybody here has before too, where someone has said something about you that isn't true, or has said you said X, Y, or Z, and he's like, no, I didn't. And so it is theoretically possible that the vice president knew nothing about this, and that his son was going off trying, for one reason or another, trying to create the impression that he could get some kind of quid pro quo, in which case the blame falls squarely on him. And so I don't know what the next step is after all of this. I mean, it certainly is something that I don't think should be, I think should be more widely reported.
Sure.
But I think as long as it's reported fairly, and it's like, it doesn't look good. It certainly, if true, it certainly does contradict what the vice president said earlier. But it's not. It's logically speaking, we can't look at this and say definitively that I don't think we can definitively say the vice president wasn't being truthful, because it's not quite evidence of that, or strong enough evidence of that, because it doesn't directly involve him.
Right. Well, and then the secondary issue, I know we're spending a lot of time on this, but the secondary issue there is the censorship too, of taking it down when it doesn't even technically fit that reasoning. The hacked information. Yeah,
that's a stretch, I think, of an explanation for that. And we could go down that path a lot. We could talk about I'm not going to go there because, all right, but yeah. So anyway, I hope Jeanette, that's what you were asking about, and we weren't going off on some completely other topic, because then she's going to comment and say, no, that's not what I meant at all. Talk about this now. And then if that's the case, I apologize. But no, I think that's what it was. So, we say on the show a lot that, we want audience participation. And Jeanette, thank you for that, because I've even said before, not just, we've had a couple people do this before. It's like not just what we say the topics are, but if there's something else you want us to talk about, throw it out there. We'll talk about it.
Absolutely.
So, all right. Story number 2, sir.
All right. This one hopefully is a little bit more uplifting. Not that the other one was. Well, yeah. All right. So Disney Pixar. If you're a Disney fan or a Pixar fan or a Disney Pixar fan, they are releasing their new movie Soul, and it's set to release December 25th, 2020. And this is interesting. Pixar again is known for tackling a lot of big subjects. But Soul really, I guess, kind of takes it to that new level. And the whole premise behind this movie is really, why is life worth living? So it follows the soul of this one character. I forget their name. But basically this character who has lived on Earth dies, or this person dies, or their soul is removed from their body, is the way they describe it, and finds itself in the, what is it called? The Great Beginning, right?
The Great Before.
The Great Before, right? And this soul who has lived meets this soul who has not lived yet, and is kind of skeptical about wanting to be born and wanting to live. And so the whole tension of this plot is a soul who doesn't want to live meets a soul who doesn't want to die, and brings in a lot of questions of the meaning of life. And this is kind of a really big, heady topic for a animated film to address. So I'm interested to see how they address it. But interesting topic, to say the least. What do you think about it?
I've got a lot of thoughts on this, and there's a lot of different directions we could go on this. The first one, kind of building on what you were just saying, it seems like the overall theme of this program is going to be, and Jeanette just commented, just all very concerning. Thank you. And I'd agree with you on that, Jeanette. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. My first thought about this is, you talk about, well, why is life worth living? That seems to be the overarching theme of this. And I mean, I'll see the movie. First of all, because it's being released on Disney Plus, and I have Disney Plus, so and it's not one of the things where you have to pay extra for it. So I'm gonna get it for free. I'll watch it.
Well, technically, you're already paying for it.
That's true. But in all honesty, though, I got to admit that the trailers, I don't know. My first reaction when I saw the first trailer was when they were showing the scenes before he passes away. Mm-hmm. I was really interested. I liked this character. I liked this Joe guy. That's his name, I think.
Yeah, Joe. Okay.
And I was like, wow, that's really cool. And then it just, I don't know. When they started showing the scenes for the souls, it just seemed like a very big tonal shift that I wasn't completely on board with. But so I might not have seen it if it was in the theaters, to be honest with you. But I'll watch it on Disney Plus. So I'll reserve final judgment on this until I see it. But let's just say this is a point of curiosity for me. How are you going to answer that question, Disney? The fact of the matter is, it's Pastor Jay here on YouTube says this movie maybe some soul ministry opportunities.
There you go.
LOL. Yes. For those of you that might be watching and maybe not from Trinity, we have a ministry called Soul, which maybe I'll let Ben elaborate on here in a little bit. But my concern about it is, again, how are you going to answer that question? Because, and we've talked about this a little bit on the show before, and I try not to get too heady about it, but where does meaning come from? And it seems to me that if you're going to do this purely as a secular, movie studio, then you're kind of limited in how you can answer that question. Yeah. And it sounds to me like we're going to have this guy, Joe, who finally found his purpose in life to make music. All right. And so he's going to be trying to convince this other soul that life has meaning because of, in his case, because I can make music, because I can do this, because this or the other. And here's my problem with that, is we can't look for our ultimate meaning in things that we do or are capable of doing, because that can all be taken away.
Absolutely.
And if that's taken away for some tragic circumstances or what have you, are you going to say that now life doesn't have meaning anymore? Are you going to look at someone who's become paralyzed and says their life doesn't have meaning? I mean, I disagree with that. And that's part of the secular mindset that is going to be troubling, I predict, for this movie. Whereas, and I'm not going to get too philosophical here, but, God can give meaning to everything. I mean, and human beings have value by our nature as being made in his image and all that. So that was my first thought, is I have some concerns about how they're going to be able to answer that question. And of course, anytime something like this comes out, was it Andrew Fletcher, I think he was from Great Britain, I believe. He was a statesman and a scholar. He said, let me write the songs of a nation. I don't care who writes its laws. And the point he was trying to make was that you influence a culture far more through the arts and the imagination than you do through mandates. And so something like this, it's going to influence people, whether or not, and it's going to influence young people. It's targeted towards children. And so they're going to maybe, I believe, get a misperception of what gives life meaning. I got another thought too, but we'll go there in a minute. I've said enough. So,
well, I like that quote that you just referenced by, was it Andrew Fletcher?
I think it's Andrew Fletcher. Somebody can Google it for me. Maybe, and I said he was British. Maybe he's Scottish. I don't know. He's somewhere over that side of the ocean.
No, but I like that quote because it reminds me of another one, that politics is downstream of culture, right? So culture, whatever is informing our cultural perception, and we've talked about that before, our perception shapes our reality, or how we perceive reality. And so the art, I agree completely that the arts and pop, we even have a subsection, we call it pop culture, popular culture. That's where a lot of people get these misconceptions. I think a lot of even Christian misconceptions that we get, we hear all the time. I was just talking to somebody not that long ago, talking about when somebody dies, they become an angel. This whole idea of the afterlife and these misconceptions that we have are shaped by that pop culture, by what they've seen in movies. Or
what did you want to know about the...
Where's he from? Andrew Fletcher.
Andrew Fletcher is a Scottish writer.
Scottish. I was right the second time.
Politician and patriot.
There you go. All right. Yeah.
Cool. Is that all you wanted to know?
That's it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We've got our own in-house fact checker. But I think culture does inform, from a secular standpoint. If you don't have that answer to what gives life meaning, then you're going to find that from culture. Culture is going to define that for you. And the same thing with this even kind of ties back into our first story of children. If the parental unit or the family unit is not raising our child, Scripture talks about, let's bring the biblical perspective in here. Train a child up in the ways of the Lord, and when they are old, they will not depart from it, or in the way they should go. And when they're old, they will not depart from it. So there's this decree from God for the family unit to be a place of nurturing. The answer to that question ultimately is, why am I here? What is my purpose? And we as Christians would answer that by saying we have meaning in the fact that we were created in the image of God, to image him. Going into, just kind of brief plug about soul ministry. It's a ministry we have here called Serving. Soul ministry stands for serving others with unconditional love. That's part of that image of God. We see that image of God in others, and we want to lift that up. And so we focus a lot on homeless and a lot on outreach, and it's about revealing that image of God in that person, that they have value simply because they are created in the image of God. And so we want to serve them and love them simply because. And so I think that does give meaning. And your other point is well taken, that if from a humanist standpoint or a secular humanism standpoint, if we put our stock, our meaning in anything else that is impermanent, then it goes away over time. And so I think they are limited, and I have that same exact question, how exactly Disney is going to answer that question, or if they're even going to answer it. It's just going to kind of be left out, for the interpretation of the viewer.
I'll tell you what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid it's going to be that whole everybody picks their own meaning, kind of thing.
Well, that's nihilism.
Yeah. I mean, and so I'm really afraid they're going to have this very subjective take on it. We'll see. I mean, that's because that's just the popular thing, out there in this mass media, so to speak. my second thought, it kind of ties into my first thought, and I'll introduce this by asking you a question. Hey, Ben, does the Bible teach that we're all pre-existent souls beforehand, wondering about whether or not we should come to Earth?
I thought you were going to go there. And no, it does not.
Yeah, I mean, again, like we talked about that Andrew Fletcher quote, people get these ideas from popular culture. And I mean, and we see things all the time that are even influencing the Christian community. We've talked about this on the show before about the poor state of theology, even within the Christian church and the people in the pews. And that's because we get influenced by what we allow ourselves to take in and by the arts. And I guess my thought, because a lot of people are asking me, well, how far do you go? Does it just mean we shouldn't be watching Harry Potter movies and all this? And I've always answered it the same way. Well, my answer to that depends, and it requires discernment on your part and as parents of children and everything like that. Because, hey, if you're well-grounded, and in your theology and your Bible, and you understand, what the Bible teaches about the soul, all right, and you watch this movie, like, I'm going to watch this movie. I've told you already, I'm going to watch this film, all right? But if you're somebody that maybe doesn't, then maybe you need to spend some more time in the Word first.
Absolutely.
Before you start trying to tackle these things. I mean, I'm not one that's in favor of totally withdrawing from all things cultural because, I'm an apologist. My job, so to speak, as an apologist is to try to reach people that are out there in the world. And if I don't know what people are talking about in the world, then I'm not going to be able to do that.
Right.
And so I'm not one that says we should completely separate ourselves. We're supposed to be in the world, but not of the world. You're still supposed to be in it. So, but things like this do also concern me because it's the same thing. It's a Wonderful Life, and heck, we did a show of that here at this church. I directed it, so I mean I can't be too critical. But the whole of Clarence the Angel, and you got Angel's got to earn his wings by doing this, that, or the other thing, and Clarence himself was a person who lived here on Earth and then became an angel after he died. And there's all sorts of ideas that get thrown out there in popular culture that aren't biblical.
Right.
And I think maybe I don't know what the answer is, but other than, encouraging people to get into their Bibles, and, we need to pay attention when our pastors are preaching on Sunday.
True. And I think, your point about all things are permissible, but not all things are beneficial. And I think I've shared this before too on this show, even that when we encounter culture in whatever form, then we have basically three responses. We can either reject it outright. We can say, I want nothing to do with it. I'm going to be a hermit and just close myself off from the world. We can receive it indiscriminately and just say, oh yes, I believe in Jesus, but I also think Buddha is a path to heaven, and Krishna and whatever, all these different, we become angels, or we're reincarnated, or we're reincarnated as angels, whatever. It's you just receive it indiscriminately, and both of those are false, obviously, but or not helpful, at least in the rejection part. Or the third option we have is to redeem culture. So when we encounter culture, because none of us are born in a cultural vacuum, we are all byproducts of our culture. There's no escape from it because we are in the world, but we are not of the world, right? So we kind of have one foot in the world, but one foot in heaven. And so being kingdom minded, there's a saying where you could be, what is it? You're so kingdom minded that you're no earthly good. And the reverse is true too. You can be so earthly minded that you're no kingdomly good or no heavenly good, right? So we have to have that balance. We have to have one foot firmly planted in the kingdom of God and on the word of God, and understanding, like you're saying, before we go into these things, what that truth is. And then we can have discernment. That's what gives us our discernment, to be able to look at this and say, okay, well, that doesn't match up with Scripture. And so I can reject this part of it. I can appreciate it for the art form that it is, but I'm not going to allow it to inform my theology.
Yeah. So that's all I got.
Yeah. No, and I think I was going to go there if you hadn't yet with the whole pre-existent souls, and it's like, obviously that's not
that's
what
not
we
and
believe.
So I mean, I don't know. Maybe
go into the pre-existent Christ, the theophany.
But do you see where the confusion lies in there, though?
Yeah.
I mean, because Christ is pre-existent. I mean, he, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All right, and so that's where we, start to see some confusion, where people have, they've heard something, they have some idea that sounds kind of familiar. Oh, this must be okay. This must be right. It's like, no.
I went to the scripture where it says, "You knew me before
I was born."
Yeah.
in that secret place in the womb. Yeah, when David is talking about, I was born in iniquity, but yeah, you taught me wisdom in that secret place. So again, but that I think more so is less a argument for a pre-existing soul, because he's talking about that secret place, referring to his mother's womb, because it's in that context of teaching me wisdom in that secret place. But yeah, no, I understand.
Right, exactly. That's one of those things that again leads to potential confusion if we're not well grounded in understanding it.
Which again, that same verse could be where we look at for where does life begin? Exactly. And so yeah.
So all right, let's move on to story number 3, shall we? All right. So story number 3 comes from the conservative media outlet Wikipedia.
The
really?
Conservative
media. Come on, I didn't get anything on that. Nothing. All right. So here's what's come out. Wikipedia, for those of you that don't know, has a series of editors. All right. Now these are not necessarily paid people. I think there is a process to become an editor. I'm not sure how they're vetted at all, but
it used to be anybody could edit.
It used to be anybody, but I know they've restricted that. And so the idea being, these are people that are supposed to go into these Wikipedia articles and edit them for accuracy. All right. Because, Wikipedia, let's face it, has a rap about, not being a reliable source of information. And so they have tried to up their editing game to offset that. This latest story may take them a few steps backwards in that regard. These editors have what are called user boxes. And my understanding is it's basically information. It's about me kind of thing. This is about the editor. And I think that's actually useful, because if I'm looking at an article that so-and-so has edited, I mean, it's like you just said, we all have, we don't grow up in a cultural vacuum. We have our inherent biases. We know that. And so knowing this information about your editor, I think actually is a good thing. It's a transparency thing. However, what apparently has happened is Wikipedia, while not banning the editors per se, has said you are not allowed to express anything in your user box that is all in favor of traditional marriage. I mean, even something, excuse me, a comment here about, for example, this user believes marriage is between one man and one woman. That's not allowed. That is considered to be discriminatory. And now the opposite is not true to my understanding. So if you have anything in there that's in favor of same-sex marriage, that's okay. But if you have anything,
for example, just change the wording and say this user believes in the inclusion of all types of union.
Right, something like that.
Yeah,
would be
allowed.
Would be allowed. Whereas saying that you believe in marriage between one man and one woman, just make that statement. That's not allowed. So now the editors are not allowed to include that in their user box. A site administrator, who I guess I'm assuming this is a screen name, Ad Orientem, resigned actually over it, and said that this decision was clearly inconsistent with Wikipedia's commitment to neutrality. And I think that's the issue. And one example that, before I get into that, because I want to get into the Jesus article example that is mentioned in a minute, because I have some thoughts on that. But before we get to that, what about your thoughts just about the user box issue and saying you can't say this in your user box?
Well, it's pretty one-sided, clearly, that someone can be for inclusion, and that's kind of this broad blanket statement that we've been, or for tolerance and inclusion, and it's all kind of under this umbrella. That those are the keywords that we have to use to be socially acceptable. But then on the other hand, someone can't stand up for their own beliefs, and if it's an about me section, that's not saying on the article itself. And so I think that's kind of,
wouldn't you want to know that? I mean, I'm just, again, I try to put myself on the other side here, and saying, if I am, let's say I'm somebody who endorses same-sex marriage, wouldn't I want to know if an article that I'm reading, even on that issue, was edited in any way, shape, or form by this particular editor that is saying I believe marriage between one man and one woman? Isn't it enhancing the transparency? And wouldn't you want to know that?
Right. And so particularly if it's relevant to the articles they're editing.
Yeah. And so all this seems to me, I don't get what Wikipedia is thinking here, because again, now maybe that's the next step. Maybe they're going to say, sorry, you can't be an editor anymore. And it is having the effect of obviously some people resigning. But if you're still allowing these folks to be editors on Wikipedia, then why wouldn't you want to know that information?
Yeah, I don't see the harm it's causing, other than somebody said that it's quote unquote pretty explicitly homophobic. Where in that I don't see that.
In fairness, I wasn't clear on that, and I told you my voice was going to go because it's so hot in here. It always does. But I wasn't clear on that, and maybe you read something differently than I did.
Or maybe it's not referring to.
I don't know if that was the same comment. I mean, whatever that was, and this may be a knock on the author of this article. There was one comment, one statement mentioned that just says, this user believes marriage is between one man and one woman. And then later on, it says this discussion began after an editor suggested that just one user box be deleted, calling it pretty explicitly homophobic. But it never said what that user box said. And so I'm not sure if the earlier statement was from that user box or whether that user box said something even more egregious that even we might say, no, you shouldn't have said that. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. And I guess there's a fine line then there about using inflammatory language in your, because, you know, if it's an about me section, what's the purpose of it? Should it be a soapbox per se? No.
Right.
So in fairness there, I guess Wikipedia has the right to structure their guidelines and their policies the way that they see fit, but I just see a discrepancy between claiming to be about inclusion and fairness and then saying, but you're not included. You can't say that. Your beliefs are not under this umbrella of tolerance.
And there's consequences to this. And this is where the article goes on to talk about, there's the Wikipedia article about Jesus. All right. And when you set up an editorial system that favors certain worldviews over others, and doesn't try to strike a balance, this is, I would say, is what you get. Yeah. And the article on Jesus, according to this piece that we're reading here, just says point blank that the quest for the historical Jesus has yielded major uncertainty on the historical reliability of the Gospels and how closely the Jesus portrayed in the Bible reflects the historical Jesus. All right, soapbox on. Here we go. All right. You ever heard of Bart Ehrman? Mm-hmm. All right. Bart Ehrman wrote a popular book, all right, called How Jesus Became God. And this is one that has been circulated probably about, 6-7 years ago, I think was when it came out. But admittedly, it was a book that wasn't really meant to be, addressing the scholarly community as much as it was a popular level thing. But this is where this comes from. And I give Bart Ehrman a credit for that. I think he largely was responsible for, I don't want to say creating this issue. He didn't. It was certainly around before that. But popularizing this viewpoint that there is a distinction between the Jesus of history and the Jesus of faith. And that those aren't the same person. And that if we were to take a historical approach to Jesus, then we would come to different conclusions, as he does, than the Christian church has been teaching for the past 2,000 years. All right. What bugs me about this, all right, is there that viewpoint? Sure, Bart Ehrman is a scholar, and he certainly has that viewpoint. But what this Wikipedia article does is it presents it as if that's the viewpoint of the scholarly community. Mm-hmm. That's just false. I mean, that's just plain false. Right. All right. And I won't go into too much here, but there are plenty of problems with Bart Ehrman's methodology, even from a historical or historian perspective. Essentially what he tries to do, and I know I was going to go soapbox and my voice is really going to get shot now, but what he tries to do is he tries to say, well, we know that the Bible, the books of the Bible, especially the New Testament that he focuses on, says certain things about Jesus and certainly says certain things about him being God. But he decided, and he thinks that you can take certain aspects of it, and to some extent I agree with him on this. There are things such as creeds. You know, the Second Corinthians, I think it is, there's a very famous creed that Paul cites in that book that is possibly the earliest testimony we have of the Christian faith. And it's clear that he's quoting a creed that predates even his book, in other words. And so what Bart Ehrman tries to say is we can look at these earliest evidences of what the earliest Christians believed. And what we find is that the earliest Christians didn't even necessarily believe Jesus was God. If anything, maybe they thought that he was a normal human who was elevated to divine status at either his baptism or at the resurrection. All right. And so he kind of became divine. But we're not talking about God like the Almighty God, okay? We're basically like an angel, is what Ehrman says, is what the earliest belief was, right? And then as time goes on, he claims that you supposedly see a shift or a growth, a development in the theology that eventually makes him this pre-existent God. The problem is he's got all sorts of problems with his approach. I mean, like one thing, for example, he says, well, according to John, you look at the Gospel of John, obviously clearly in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, was with God, and the Word was God. He says by the time we get to John, it is this incarnational theology, where he was clearly he was God incarnate, But the problem is when he points to other gospels and he says, see, these other gospels have language that show that it wasn't incarnational, didn't have an incarnational theology. They had this, I'm forgetting the term right now, and I'm gonna kick myself later on, but glorification isn't the word, but yeah.
It starts with an A. Is that the one you're looking
I think so.
Apotheosis.
I don't know, but there's a term that basically he became divine at some.
Yeah,
he became divine at some point down the line. And he says if you look at these other gospels, you see the way they talk about Jesus. The earlier sources clearly talk about him not being necessarily being incarnate, God incarnate, but he became divine sometime later on. The problem is some of that same language that he's using in these other gospels, these other writings, is also present in the Gospel of John. And it's because Jesus was glorified. He was, elevated to God's right hand. There was an aspect of that. So these aren't... There's one term, adoptionism. Adoptionism is the belief, yes, that he was adopted by God. And that's one thing. That's not the term I was looking for. But yeah, that is one term for it. And so that's the idea, is that there's an inconsistency problems, because he's saying, see, look at these terms. They show that God, they didn't really think, the way they talk about him, he really wasn't God incarnate. He wasn't pre-existent. Okay, but that same language is also present in other things where he clearly was. And so, no, don't use Wikipedia.
I believe it's apotheosis.
But
Apotheo.
And so I don't want to get too much into it, but he basically picks and chooses what he wants to cite as evidence to fit what really is a presupposed framework. He presupposes this framework of going from, being adopted to being incarnate. And then he interprets the data in light of that, as opposed to allowing the data to influence what his framework's going to be.
Right. And when you look at the synoptic gospels, they clearly borrow from one another. And so I guess his point there would be that it was developed over time. But even the earliest, I think Mark is the earliest one, and that was 65, 80. It was within one generation after Jesus was resurrected. And so to separate the quote unquote historical Jesus from the Gospels, the Gospels in and of themselves are historical documents dating back to within one generation of Christ being on this earth. So that...
Well, and you can go back even further than that. I mean, in Paul's writings, there's clearly language about Jesus being divine in Paul's writings. Yeah. And it's funny because even with some of these creeds, he tries to explain it away because, he tried to say that, well, even Ehrman concedes that, okay, Paul probably thought of Jesus as being the incarnate God based on other things that Paul says. But if you look at these creeds that he was quoting, they don't really say that. Really, then why was Paul quoting them? I mean, Paul clearly he thought that they supported whatever he was saying. Yeah. So it's all sorts of inconsistencies in there. Anyway, that's my soapbox. But my issue with this is there's all sorts of scholarship out there that comes to the exact opposite conclusion. I obviously think it is more well thought out and accurate scholarship. And it's not even mentioned. And the way this Wikipedia article on Jesus is presented, it's only giving this one viewpoint and talking about like this is the only one out there, and it's not. And that's what you get when you limit your editorial board by viewpoint.
Yeah, and I think the end quote of this article really sums up what you're saying. It says, I'll just read it. In other respects, this article referring to the one about Jesus, the article can be fairly described as a liberal academic discussion of Jesus, focusing especially on assorted difficulties and controversies while failing to explain traditional or orthodox views of those issues. So it might be quote-unquote academic, but what it is not is neutral, not in the original sense we defined for Wikipedia. So here again, yeah, you can say something that is a scholarly article, but clearly not neutral.
Pastor Jay, I hate you a little right now. I just want to say that. Sorry. He's texting me something about the Ohio State-Nebraska football game, talking about the average number of points that Ohio State has scored against Nebraska. I'm on the air, man. Come on.
Everybody's updated at least. Oh, hey.
What was?
Ding.
Yeah, that.
No,
I think that is, the term is accurate. Let me just by way of explanation, the term I was trying to come up with is the way that Bart Ehrman defines it. There's two terms that he uses to describe these different types of theology. One is incarnational, and it's Bart Ehrman's other term that I'm trying to think of that I'm not coming up with.
Gotcha.
So anyway,
I mean, yeah. Other than what we've discussed about this, it is concerning. I think that a site, and I guess what's more concerning is that it's not just Wikipedia that we're seeing this happen with. That it seems to be a growing trend of non-neutrality. Even sites such as Wikipedia, something that holds itself up as being neutral, and it wants to be, at least. I know it's gotten a bad rap before about not being reliable, but it's like you said in the beginning, that this has taken them a step back or two. But they clearly hold themselves up to be a academic resource, and that's part of the concern about again, goes back to the issue of censorship and rewriting history, honestly. And that's I think where it's trending, and it's concerning.
All right, I've done my soapbox talk for the day, so let's move on to our last story. Ben, what's our last story? And Mary Kay, can you do me a favor? There's another bottle of water there next to you. Can you toss that to me? Thank you.
Our final story is from ChristianHeadlines.com. It talks about a clergy shortage grows to more than 3,000 Catholics for every priest. Vatican data shows. So this is this article specifically references Vatican data, so it's more in the Catholic realm, but it does spill out into the evangelical and wider Protestant denominations as well. I don't have the specific numbers that this article does for the Catholic one. I don't have the specific corresponding numbers in the Protestant realm, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's not.
It's not a trend unique to the Catholic Church.
No, not at all. But so this talks about that the World Mission Day was this past Sunday, October the 18th, and they released this data from the Vatican that there's this growing trend that they're decreasing. The number of priests in the world decreased to 414,065 in 2018. Europe registered a drop of 2,675. I'm not going to go through all the numbers.
Thank you.
Yeah, because there's a lot of numbers here. But that number, the 414,000, is where they get the one for every 3,000, because there are reportedly 1.3 billion Catholics in the world. So you divide 414,000 by 1.3 billion. That's a lot of parishioners per priest, and it's a concern because now there are some spots in here where they talk about, for example, in Africa and Asia, they're actually growing in. I think seminarians are actually increasing in there, but large part the majority of the rest of the world, particularly Europe and America, are severely declining. And I think this speaks to what has been a trend, but also it's been, again, kind of like what we said with other church trends, has been exaggerated by COVID now that we see. what's your take?
First thing I was going to say is what you already touched on, is that this is certainly not a phenomenon that's limited to the Catholic Church. I think we're seeing this in the evangelical world. We're seeing it, across Christendom. That I think most seminaries will tell you that they're seeing a decreased enrollment. What I found interesting about it, and maybe this just because of personally who I am, but it did say this as well: the number of clergy might be declining globally. The presence of lay missionaries is on the rise, and primarily in America and Asia. And so here in America, we're seeing a decrease in, at least in the Catholic Church, and I think broader than that, clergy, but an increase in lay missionaries. And it just got me wondering, I wonder why that is. What is it about, why are people not wanting to go into be clergy, but still feeling God's call to be some kind of a lay leader, in this regard? And, I look at myself. I mean, I'm in seminary, but I'm not pursuing an MDiv. I'm pursuing a master's in Christian apologetics. And so I kind of start thinking, well, why is that? If I were to be honest with myself and ask, why did I opt to go the lay route as opposed to the clergy route? And if anybody's expecting me to give some brilliant answer here, I don't have one. I don't know. I can just say that's not where I was feeling called. But I think that's an interesting question about what is there something, for example, and I'm not saying this is it, I'm just throwing it out there. Is there something that we are doing as a church that is discouraging people from wanting to be in the clergy?
Yeah, and I can speak for myself too, being in seminary also. But I was in the MDiv program, and I'm in an MMin, which can still be pastoral, and so certain denominations or whatever. However, I think there's, and I'm not going to speak for everybody, but it's just my suspicion that there is a part of why we're seeing this trend, and this article even cites this as part of that reason, is you see an increase in a distrust of organized religion in the broader population at large, as well as in the church itself. Distrust because of certain scandals that have gone on, financial, sexual. There's also, a growing trend in again, the wider population to say, I'm spiritual but not religious. So there's this distrust of organized religion, yet there's still a desire to serve. There's still a missional. People want to be connected with that service. There's an innate, I think, drive for that. And so I think that at least partly might have something to do with it. And so when you ask the question of, is it something that the church has done, maybe inadvertently, I think, at least partly, that and we kind of touched on this last week with the whole Ravi Zacharias thing, that the enemy uses this as, whenever there's a scandal or something big, can use that as an opportunity to cause division, or those people who are kind of sitting on the fence to say, you know what, I don't want anything to do with organized religion. Or those people, another side of that coin might be, or those people who might have been considering pursuing leadership to say, you know what, I don't want all that attention. I don't want to, be under that much scrutiny. And so I'm going to pursue a lay route.
Well, and I will say I'm very glad this gentleman is still watching, because it's a pastoral perspective. And Pastor Jay asks a very good question that I was actually hinting on what direction I was going to go with this, actually. When the clergy go away, what does the church look like? And I mean, the first thing I was going to say in response to that is, if people look at these trends, and this article touched on this too, don't panic, because ultimately panic is not the right response, because our faith is not in clergy, it's not in individual pastors, it's not in priests, it's in God, and God's not going anywhere. And I guess my thought process on this is if we have a decrease in people being called to clergy, and I don't want to sound like I'm diminishing the role of clergy at all. I'm not. I mean, we talked earlier when we were talking about soul, about, people, lay people not always having an accurate biblical understanding. And so there's definitely a role we need to make sure that is still happening. But do we almost, and maybe this is a contributing factor, have we almost slipped into a church culture of over-reliance on clergy, where we think, I mean, just to give you one example, it's like people thinking, well, it's the pastor's job to go out and evangelize people, the pastor's job to do this, the pastor's job to do that. No, it's not. The pastor is, for
kind of gives laity an out, so to speak.
Yeah. And if that's my impression of what a pastor's supposed to be doing, it's like, okay, so the lady comes, they sing songs, they say prayers for an hour, they give you some money, and then pastor, the rest of the week you got to go out and do everything. I don't think I want that gig either. So what can the church look like if we have a diminishing role of clergy?
Yeah, and I like what I'm going to butcher this, and so I apologize in advance. Archbishop Protase Rugambwa.
Yeah, you butchered it. I'm not going to try it.
But he said, his response to this, he says, we mustn't be afraid. Mission goes on thanks to the power of the Holy Spirit. So again, kind of, we all have that same Holy Spirit, right? Every believer has that Holy Spirit. And so Scripture talks about it. Don't be afraid at that time what to say, because the Holy Spirit will give you those words to say. So I think what the church looks like is greater and greater reliance. Especially, it's going to be partly out of necessity because of we see it now. I know at least of a couple of churches that don't have a full-time pastor leading them, and so they rely on lay leadership or a pastor who's bivocational who work a 40-hour work week, and then on Sundays.
Pastor Jay agrees with you, by the way. I got a yes with an exclamation
point. There we go. Awesome. Yeah. So.
Or he agreed with me.
He agreed with one of us. Maybe.
Yeah. He agreed with something someone said.
Well, good. But yeah, so either you have a pastor who's bivocational who works somewhere else during the week, and then on Sunday pastors. Pastors
or multiple
preachers,
churches. That's the other thing I thought of.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, if you have an increased reliance upon lay ministry and lay leadership, could you have? I mean, do we? And I don't know the answer to this. I'm not claiming that I have all the answers. Just thoughts that come to my head that I blurt out because I have a microphone in front of me. Could we rethink the structure of the way we do church? And so you have kind of a pastoral overseer, to use a biblical term, of multiple churches, but the leadership structure, the organizational structure, and the mission structure of the church is more lay driven. He says strong churches have strong laity. Thank you. See, and 30-second delay. So I didn't know he was going to say that. The gospel wasn't spread by pastors. Yeah.
True.
And so could we think of a different vision like that where, we get stuck in what we're used to, and we're used to having this church. Every church has its own pastor.
Right.
And like I said, sometimes we have misconceptions of what the role of the pastor should be.
Sure.
But is that something we think of? Do we rethink the way we structure church that way?
Well, I think it's going to come down to, if this trend continues, it's not even going to be do we. It's we're going to have to. It's a necessity almost. At some point, if that trend continues, churches are going to be faced with either, okay, we're either going to adapt, to use Pastor Jay's phrase here, adapt or die. Either the church has to close down its doors because we don't have an ordained pastor, or we're going to have to figure something else out.
Right.
And so should we be open to that? Yeah, I mean, look at the Acts 2 community, right? You have the apostles, right? You have clear leadership and eldership, and Paul lists those in Timothy, and all of these qualifications for eldership. But yeah, the gospel wasn't spread by pastors, ordained ministers. It was everyone.
Yeah, he did clarify. He did say early on, and I understood what he meant. But he's right. I look back at his comments, says the gospel wasn't spread by pastors, and he added early on. So I get what you're saying.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, I think
maybe we call it a Paul model. I mean, if you think about it, think about Paul. Paul went out. He started a whole bunch of churches, but he didn't stay there.
Right.
But at the same time,
he raised up leaders in those churches.
He raised up leaders within those churches, and then he stayed in touch, and he still, he'd write them letters, he'd give them the guidance. And so if we look at that framework, the way that Paul did the early church, maybe that can give us some insight into how we can do things now. And then he says some things have to die to be resurrected, including churches. Thoughts. He's asking for our thoughts on that. Yeah, I like it. You know, you're benefiting Pastor Jay from the fact that you only have so many characters in the YouTube live chat, because that's called passing the buck. That is what that comment is. Yeah, this is going to be a hot topic. What are your thoughts on it? So, hey Ben, what are your thoughts on it? Some things have to die in order to be resurrected, including churches. What say you?
Well, I mean, okay, biblically, a seed, it talks about a seed, unless it dies, cannot sprout again, right? When the seed dies, goes into the ground, then it can grow again. So yeah, there is a biblical principle there that things need to die to come back to life. That's a whole concept why we baptize. We are united with Christ in a death like his, will be united with Christ in a resurrection like his. And so there is this, dying to the old self, the old flesh, the old Adam. So that's biblical, that principle. And from a church, as a church body, if something doesn't match up with Scripture, then absolutely it needs to die. We need to cast out. It's the same principle, whether it's in our personal or corporate walks of faith. Then if something doesn't match up with Scripture, then we need to be putting it to death. And in that crucifying the flesh metaphor.
Yeah. And Pastor Jay's latest comment asks, did I say that the Bucks will be passing, meaning the Buckeyes? It's another pot shot with Ohio State, Nebraska. And I'll answer you this way, sir. Yes, because they're going to be so far behind in the fourth quarter, they're going to have to abandon the run game, and they're going to have to pass the ball. No, I've been on record with my devotion earlier this week about what I think Nebraska's chances are, but not good. But no, I agree that even it gets back to what I was saying before about we get caught up in what we're used to, that we want to cling so much to what we're used to that we're not willing to let go of it. And sometimes the response to that is we don't want to let things die, when really letting something die can actually give birth to something else that's more capable of thriving. How much do we hold ourselves back because we're clinging to something in the past that's just not the way? I mean, we don't share the gospel the same way today that they did, in the earth. I mean, of course, I just made that Paul analogy, so maybe people are going to say that I'm contradicting myself. But I mean, methodologically, They didn't have the internet, they didn't have weekly podcasts, and so the message doesn't change, but the method changes. And when we cling too much to old methods, sometimes, and if you get to a church organizational structure, the way it's thought out, the way it's organized, that is really more suited to times gone by, then yeah, I think we've got to be willing. There's a phrase in screenwriting, all right, and I used to teach. I've done some screenwriting. I'm a film guy, and it's a morbid phrase. I'll preface that, okay, but you can't be afraid to kill your babies, all right, and here's what it's referring to is that lots of times when you're writing, and I'm sure novelists do this too. My experience is in writing screenplays for film, but you're writing a screenplay. And you write this scene that you think is great. It's just, you love it. It's your favorite thing. It's like, I have never written anything so eloquent as this scene that I just wrote. And then you finish the whole screenplay and you go back and you look at it and you realize, but it doesn't advance the plot at all. It doesn't develop the characters. My characters are in no different position at the end of that scene than they were at the beginning. I may love it, but I got to let it go. I got to cut it out. The same could be true of our mentality towards how we do church, I think.
Yeah, I'll quote, I might have used this before on the show, but one of my mentors, Duffy Robbins, used to say, sacred cows make good hamburgers. So sometimes we have those sacred cows in the church where it's something we've done because we've always done it. And that has the danger of becoming an idol even unto itself, if that's something that we hold up and esteem as something we have to do it this way, because I'm not saying that's always the case, but it has that potential that if we're holding that up as a traditionalism, then yeah, what are we? Is it serving to? Well, taking the plot, it's not if something's not serving to advance the plot, it's something serving to advance the gospel,
right?
And if it's not, then
you got to let it go. And this isn't to diminish the role it played in the past.
Sure,
things could have been great at advancing the gospel. I mean, you look back. Let's talk about Billy Graham, for example. All right, Billy Graham and his evangelistic crusades and the big television productions and all of that he did. I know a lot of people love Billy Graham to death. Really, Pastor Jay? Sorry. He's changing. He's going on what you're saying because he has no response to my Ohio State's going to have to pass the ball comment. No, but I mean, those types of television programs and everything like that, especially when there were fewer networks and fewer options, they had a role at the time. But you're not going to see that kind of thing today. We got an era of the internet. People get their information and their entertainment differently. And so it doesn't diminish the role something might have played at some point in the past to say that that's just not the way we should be doing things now. And to tie it all back together, I do think that the natural reaction when we see this clergy shortage like this is, what are we going to do? The sky is falling. Chicken Little's running around. And it's not to say that we don't want to encourage vocations to the clergy. Sure we do. And I think there's still a role for that. But we also have to be prepared for the fact that God may be moving us in a different direction. And when we do get moved in a different direction, our response is not to hold on to the past as much as it is to be open to where God's leading us now and say, okay, how can we spread the gospel now?
Right.
So
and some of that, and not to diminish either the pain involved in that. Actually, referencing Ryan's sermon this past week, he talked about the Jews rebuilding the wall in Nehemiah, and they had to clear out the debris and the rubble of this scarred things they held sacred. They're literally clearing those away in order to build anew. And I think there is pain involved in that. So we can't diminish that, but also to understand what lies ahead too, and where God would be calling us not to stay in the past, but to move forward.
It's tough, but I got to say, in this whole era of COVID and declining vocations, the clergy and everything that we see with the church today, Pastor Jay asked in his message 2 weeks ago, who's ready for a revival of that sort? And he's watching, so I'm trying to remember who it was he was talking about, and I'm forgetting now. But what's that? Pastor Jay in his sermon 2 weeks ago was talking about a particular. He was quoting somebody and talking about this revival that took place and he was saying,
he might remind you.
It was a man in New York.
It was a man. Oh, that's right. It was a guy in New York, and he started with only a couple people showed up, and the next week there were more.
It was prayer meetings.
Prayer meetings, something like that. And he asked the question, who's ready for that kind of, he's not going to comment because how much you want to bet he doesn't remember himself. He's pulling up his own sermon notes.
Or he's just waiting to see if you remember.
No, but
he's letting you dig.
But he asked, who's ready, who thinks we need that kind of revival. I do, and in this way. I think this is what that kind of revival should look like. And then, of course, they went on to ask, who's willing to do whatever God needs you to do in order to bring that about? And that's the harder question for us to swallow, because a revival, too many of us, I think revival is everybody else coming to us, whereas true revival often requires sacrifice on our part and being willing to do whatever God wants us to do to further that revival. I do think we need a revival. I think we need a revival in the way we think a church is organized and structured. But that's going to be hard. You're right. It's going to be painful.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, all right. I think we are talked out. My voice is kind of, it's actually a little better now than it was 20 minutes ago or so. But
did we go through all the cards?
I didn't even, what time did we get up to, Mary Kay? Are we we have another 500-year Reformation. Yeah. Hey. Oh, look at that. You see what he did there? Because Reformation Sunday this Sunday. I see what you did there. Tying that all in.
All ties together.
But it's going to be painful. We're almost to the 80-minute mark, but that's okay. You got things that go up to 90, so we're okay.
So we got 10 more minutes. I mean,
before she runs out of songs.
If anybody else has another story that
you're already crying.
All right, I think we could sign off now. So, hey, great discussion today. Thank you for everybody who joined in here this evening. Just a reminder, we are here for this program. We are here every Wednesday night at 5:30. I invite you, if you're just tuning in for this program, to check out the Trinity Japa channel. We have got so much on the channel here. Obviously, this is our weekly talk show, our weekly podcast. We've got worship services, both traditional and contemporary. We got a whole section on our YouTube homepage just for Trinity kids, including our weekly children's program, Kids Zone Fruits of the Spirit, which is really cool. So we got something for all ages here. We are looking for subscribers. Last I checked, I think we were around like 938 or so. We're trying to get to that magic 1,000 subscriber mark. So if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please go ahead, hit the subscribe button, subscribe for us, and pound the like button on this video as well. Just make sure you can hit it as many times as you want, as long as it's an odd number. That's my motto. Because if you do an even number, it turns it back off again. You see? So
I see what you're saying.
So just odd number. Hit it as many times as you want. Just make sure you end an odd number. Like this video, please. Share it. Tell other people about it. Share the channel. We'd really appreciate it. All right. So thank you. Thank you, Mary Kay. Thank you, everyone, for commenting. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Ken.
See you all next week. God bless.